A global software outage has crippled airlines, banks, supermarkets and media outlets.
The major IT outage has grounded thousands of flights, affected electronic payments, healthcare providers.
Some Woolworths stores shut because people were unable to buy things at checkout.
And looks to be related to one of the largest cybersecurity vendors, CrowdStrike, and its software called the Falcon Sensor.
So retail across the country experienced difficulties on Friday, as you probably know, and into Saturday as payment systems went down.
A week on from the CrowdStrike tech outage, and still not all systems are back online.
It was dubbed the blue screen of death, and there was little the tech industry here could do to help, because all the vital information Microsoft holds on us is held offshore.
So we lose our sovereignty, and we also lose our ability to dictate or even have a say in what and how we want our data managed.
Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, the big data grab has left us vulnerable. Who is storing our information, and what's being done to protect it? There are moves by tech giants, including Microsoft and Amazon, to establish New Zealand-based data centres. But that alone is not going to solve these problems.
What legal safeguards have we that they are still not going to abuse that data when it's in New Zealand? It needs a better legal regime. I think the legal regime we have at the moment is very weak.
Gahen Gunasekara from the University of Auckland is trying to figure out if data sovereignty is achievable. The Associate Professor of Commercial Law is looking at New Zealand's laws around data management and suggests that localising data storage doesn't necessarily lead to data sovereignty.
I often give Kim.com's example because people say, well, keeping the data in New Zealand will protect it. Well, in that case, it didn't. Kim.com, of course, its servers were, I think, in New Zealand and in Hong Kong, but the New Zealand servers were locked down because the FBI requested the New Zealand government to lock them down. And everyone, even the people who were completely innocent, suddenly lost all of their photograph albums, their videos and everything, because some of the people using the platform might have been doing fairly dodgy stuff. So keeping the data in New Zealand didn't protect it in that instance.
It's not just keeping data that's the issue. It's regulating what the service providers storing the information can do with it.
People now want to do things like they want to process the data. They want to use the data to train algorithms. And processing uses a lot of computing power. And there are very few New Zealand companies that have the type of processing power, although they are being built by the likes of Amazon and Meta. But the problem is that those data centers are often operated almost inevitably by those large international companies. Yes, they promise they will keep the data in New Zealand, but they can still process the data in New Zealand. And my question is, for what purposes? At the same time, we need to be careful about arguing that data sovereignty means keeping the data in one jurisdiction, in our jurisdiction. Because if we do that, we can't offer our services to other countries. As to say that New Zealand has this environmentally sustainable energy, we can process your data. Well, the other countries might say, well, okay, if you think data sovereignty means keeping the data in the country where it originated, why should we send it to you? You see, so there's a catch-22 there. We need to be careful about what we define data sovereignty as being.
Data is an extremely valuable resource, but only if it can be used. In this case, for things like developing algorithms and AI technology. And the way New Zealand laws are currently written allows cloud service providers to use our data a lot.
They have clauses that are written in their terms of use that are very wide. And what they say is we will not identify you. We will take steps to keep the data secure. We're not going to allow any third parties to access it, etc. But we will aggregate the data, strip off all the identifying information about it, pool the data with all the other data that we have, and use it for analytical purposes that will improve our services or something very generic like that. What that essentially means is they're using the data to make perhaps new discoveries, new inventions, which is not going to benefit the customer. It's going to benefit the company that's got the data. That's why there's a big data grab. All the companies, whether it's Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they all want to get as much data as possible. Why is that? It's because they can then use it to train their algorithms. And I think that's what's going on behind the scenes.
But if they're using it to train their algorithms, as you say, and make their systems better, wouldn't we as customers then benefit from that?
Yes, potentially. That's one way of looking at it. Perhaps it shouldn't be something that is banned or disallowed. But the question is, are they doing it only to benefit the customers, or are they also doing it to benefit their own services? And this is where we get into competition law issues, because in Europe, for example, they've passed legislation that stops companies using that data to get collateral benefits for themselves. So let's say one of your customers is a company that provides telecommunications, let's say, and they're using Google to store their data. Now, Google also offers a parallel telecommunications Wi-Fi service or something, let's say, for argument's sake. They can find out everything about their clients, and they can exploit that data to improve their own services to compete with their own client, right, which is kind of anti-competitive. So what they've done in Europe is to pass legislation like the Digital Markets Act, which essentially says that if you are a gatekeeper, you are a player that has significant market power, you cannot use those benefits to compete, essentially, to build competing products, because you're essentially providing infrastructure. You're not there to steal the secrets of your customers. Now, we have nothing comparable in New Zealand.
What New Zealand does have is the Privacy Act. Because data storage within New Zealand is very limited, organisations will employ an external provider, like Microsoft or Google. And the data privacy section in the Act clarifies the roles and responsibilities of each party. But there are flaws. For example, if something happens to the data, let's say it gets lost or is used in a way that breaches privacy, it's not Microsoft or Google that are liable. The organisation that uses them, referred to in the Act as Agency A, is the one responsible.
So then it's up to Agency A through its contract with Agency B to try and recoup any losses. And that's fair enough. I mean, they would be expected to protect their interests by having clauses in their contract. But the crux of it is, though, while Agency B is processing the information, as long as it's not identifying people and using it for some completely unrelated purpose, it can process the data to make profits for itself by, for example, developing algorithms. There's nothing in the law that clearly states that Agency B is not allowed to use the data while it's in its safe custody or while it's being processed. So let me give you a very good example of a case that I read in Australia.
The case involved a data brokerage, which are providers that collect, analyse and license user data for marketing purposes. A New Zealand example is the supermarket loyalty reward programs.
The company was able to track people's grocery purchases over a 20-year period. It could also then link that to that household's entertainment expenditure. So in other words, do they go to the movies? Do they go to restaurants? They combine that data with the data about property, the address of that property, how much the property was worth, the property records, when was the last time that property was sold. From that data, they were able to track changes in the individual's expenditure. So that showed suddenly household expenditure suddenly goes down on groceries. At the same time, it goes up on entertainment. That immediately tells these people they're empty nesters. Their kids have now grown up and their house is probably going to be on the market soon. So let's target them with a targeted advertisement. So that's the kind of thing that the data allows these companies to do.
After investigating the case, the Australian Commerce Commission was concerned about the lack of transparency. It recommended providers be more open with consumers about how they target their advertisements. But protecting individual data is just one aspect of this digital puzzle.
The other aspect that I think we need to be careful about when we talk about sovereignty is government. The governments using these large corporations need to be careful. As individuals, obviously, we need to look after our own interests, but governments have a higher duty to look after New Zealand's essential interests, economic interests, security interests. Huawei, for example, was blacklisted.
The government says we have to trust its spy agency decision to reject a joint deal between Spark and the telco giant Huawei. It's citing serious security concerns which have prompted a furious denial from Huawei. Security analysts, however, warn New Zealand may find it impossible to please two cherished allies and resolve the clash between national security requirements and trade interests.
More recently, of course, there have been concerns about companies that have links to Israel.
The government has hired an online surveillance firm that's been kicked off Facebook for spying on people. Immigration New Zealand has been using the firm Cobwebs Technologies for about 2 years. Documents show that the firm, set up by former Israeli spies, scours all social media platforms like Twitter and WhatsApp. But officials here won't reveal exactly why they want the material, saying it's too sensitive.
Now, Israel has in the past conducted activities not friendly to New Zealand. People may recall there were alleged Israeli agents who were caught trying to get hold of a fake New Zealand passport, and they were actually sent to jail. That, to me, indicates we need to be careful when we're dealing with companies like Cobwebs, because we don't know if the data is secure. So these are the kinds of questions we need to consider, and I think the New Zealand government has a duty to take more due diligence when it employs these companies. And they're building data centers in New Zealand. That's all very, very well and good. But what legal safeguards have we that they are still not going to abuse that data when it's in New Zealand? What are the kind of accountability mechanisms? In other words, are there going to be audits? Is there going to be some kind of random audit where people can go in and see what the data flows were? And what are the gatekeepers? Are the gatekeepers going to monitor flows of data that go out of New Zealand? These are all things that are possible to put in place. You can actually have technology itself can be employed, but it needs a better legal regime. I think the legal regime we have at the moment is very weak. And the Privacy Act itself, I think, needs to be tightened. Agency A and Agency B need to be forced to have more accountability so that people can be sure that if you do use a cloud provider, have you taken the due diligence steps to make sure that that cloud provider has given robust undertakings that it will not use the data for ulterior motives or ulterior purposes?
There are particular concerns about data use, privacy and protection amongst Indigenous people worldwide. And there are some significant moves in that sphere here in Aotearoa. After years of negotiations, Te Tumu Paeroa, the Office of the Māori Trustee, has entered a groundbreaking deal with Microsoft to develop a centre in New Zealand for Māori data. The agreement guarantees the data stored in the centre won't leave the country, unlike the typical cloud-based services that Microsoft provides. Here's Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru, an AI and data ethicist with a background in Māori rights in the digital sphere.
So what typically happens when all of us use our online banking, Facebook, Instagram, just about anything we put our data in through an internet browser, our data goes usually to America or Singapore, sometimes other countries. So by default, we've become bound by American law, Australian law, Singapore law, and in addition to New Zealand law. So we lose our sovereignty. And we also lose our ability to manage and to dictate or even have a say in what and how we want our data managed. I think in the last few weeks, we've seen some big impacts here. So we had the major internet outage several weeks ago.
The CrowdStrike IT outage, a faulty update by the US cybersecurity firm, caused global disruptions for around 8.5 million Windows devices.
We had the outage with Microsoft servers.
Microsoft, which has this cloud service called Azure, which thousands of New Zealand organisations connect to, it had what's called a denial of service attack.
And these were out of the control of New Zealanders. We basically had to rely on international providers.
Right.
So by bringing our data back to New Zealand, at least our data is in New Zealand. So my understanding is that this will allow Te Tumu Paeroa to have cultural rights over the data. They have a say on where the data is. They have a number of opportunities to ensure that tikanga Māori cultural practices are used with their data. These sort of protocols would never, ever be allowed with our data overseas. Allowing a pōwhiri, blessings, karakia, those things would be breaches of security. And plus, Americans would not understand our cultural reasoning for that. It also helps to ensure that New Zealand privacy laws and New Zealand laws become more front and centre.
The kind of data that this deal includes are things like Māori land court documents, details on the trust's income, grants and scholarships, and individual shareholders' personal information.
But it's also our future generations' data. And that's basically any Māori individual whose parents own Māori land, when they pass, it's succeeded to them. So it's their data. So every day there's more data being added and new individuals being added to that data.
Why is specifically data sovereignty over Māori data important?
So in New Zealand, I think most people know we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which Article 2 gives Māori rights to taonga. So Māori data is considered as a taonga. In 2018, a group of claimants took the government to the Waitangi Tribunal for breaches of Te Tiriti in relation to data.
The revised TPP, now known as the CPTPP, is a free trade agreement involving New Zealand and 10 other countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Māori leaders had major concerns over sovereignty in the agreement. The tribunal found, despite revisions and increased tangata whenua involvement later in the negotiations, risks remain to Māori interests arising from the e-commerce provisions, and the Crown has breached treaty principles.
So that's from a local perspective. From an international perspective, in 2010, the New Zealand government signed up to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Prior to Indigenous data sovereignty, we used to talk about country data sovereignty. Like New Zealand should be sovereign owners of their own data. It made more business sense to put our data in the cloud. So then we started forgetting about country data sovereignty. And as a result, we did see Indigenous data sovereignty, Māori data sovereignty, Pasifika data sovereignty movements being created and pushing for those rights to be recognised.
This deal will make sure New Zealand law and Māori tikanga is front and centre when it comes to the management of this data. And that's important because it makes sure the way it's used and treated is in line with Māori cultural values.
When we talk about iwi data, marae, hapu, Māori organisational data, not one person can own that data. And in fact, from a Te Ao Māori perspective, we don't talk about ownership. We more talk about guardianship, the kaitiaki of the data. If we talk about facial recognition technology, biometrics, DNA, genomic data, and from a Western perspective, that's your personal data. But from a Te Ao Māori perspective, it should be a collective decision. If I gave an organisation my DNA, that's not just me, that's all of my ancestors, all of my current family, and all of my future family's DNA that I'm providing. I think we need to draw the line that some data is individual data. So, for example, our health data should be our individual data. But we should have the right to then allow others to share our data or to view our data. From a Te Ao Māori perspective, we need to sit down and say, look, what is collective data? What is individual data? What data do we consider to be tapu or sacred? And what data do we consider has no value? And then I think we can have the conversations about, collective rights, individual rights, data sovereignty, jurisdictional sovereignty. But there's a little way to go on that.
Microsoft is the world's largest technology company and is headquartered in America. So how will a deal made with this organisation ensure data stays in Aotearoa?
The data is being stored in a cloud system, and that cloud system has encryption that gives a high level of sovereignty to the data owners. The reality is that, yes, it's an American-owned company, which does have obligations to the American government. I mean, it's not full data sovereignty, but it's a large step towards data sovereignty. Now the reality is that it's very, very difficult for New Zealanders and for Māori to have full 100% data sovereignty. We don't have the data centres. We don't have the infrastructure in New Zealand to be able to do that right now. There are a number of small providers who could give a high level of data sovereignty. But again, if we're talking true Māori data sovereignty, we would have a Māori-owned data centre with open source software, which is managed and maintained by Māori. Personally, I don't think it's 100% feasible, but the likes of Microsoft and others who are offering jurisdictional sovereignty, i.e. our data in New Zealand, it's a huge step forward.
There's a couple of things I want to touch on. You mentioned that the data will be encrypted. Who holds the key to that then?
Based on all the public information about the technology they are using, is that the data owners will have the key to unlock the encryption, not Microsoft. Talking to my technical colleagues, they've told me it would be extremely difficult to have that encryption broken. So that gives a large amount of, comfort and protection having the data in New Zealand.
Well, yeah, because the keys to that data will be held in Aotearoa.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And then also another thing, jurisdictional sovereignty. Can you expand on that?
So jurisdictional sovereignty just says that, the data is in your own country and you have some sort of say over the data that you wouldn't if it was in a different country.
With the way that technology works these days, I mean, anyone who's got Facebook, Instagram, X, if you sign up to one of those platforms and you put your data into that platform, your data is always going to be free-flowing from between borders, isn't it?
That's correct. Whenever you sign up for a social media, most people aren't going to do this, but if you actually look in the terms of conditions, you give the social media companies full intellectual property rights of all of your data. They can sell your data. If they like an image of you, some of them can use it for advertising. You basically lose all your rights and privacy when you use social media. I think, most people, they're happy to do that for the right to be able to use social media and keep in contact with others. I think these data centres are going to be more about our personal data, like banking, government records, all those things that we use with businesses as opposed to entertainment.
Te Tumu Paeroa's deal with Microsoft could change the way Indigenous data is managed worldwide and provides a blueprint for how New Zealand could gain sovereignty over all its data. That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thanks to Associate Professor Gihan Gunasakara and Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Mark Chesterman. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite anō.